Welcome, and thank you for tuning in on Yachting International Radio. My name is Eva Lianne Veldkamp, and you are listening to Maritime Unity, the podcast where we talk about inclusion and safety and how it relates to connection with humanity. Today we will talk with Jessica St. Germain about policy and reporting of bullying and harassment. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Eva. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for being here with us today. It's so exciting to speak with you. And we're going to talk about some pretty cool things, I have to say. So let's start. Can you give us a little introduction about who you are and what you love to do most and what you're doing?
Sure. Thanks so much. So my name's Jessica St. Germain. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a director of consulting at RAINN. RAINN is an organization, a US-based organization that does anti-sexual violence work. We operate the National Sexual Assault Hotline that can be accessed around the world for emotional support and is a wonderful resource. And RAINN also has a consulting group. It's called RAINN Consulting Group, and that's where I work. I'm a director of consulting there. We do all different types of projects with organizations, governmental organizations, schools on their sexual misconduct prevention and response efforts. So really a wonderful experience here. I've been with RAINN for about 1.5 years now. I am an attorney by background, so I don't practice at RAINN, but prior to coming to RAINN, I was an attorney with a rape crisis center and crime victim center where I live in New York in the US and provided direct services to victims of all different types of crimes, but most commonly sexual assault. And I also did a lot of prevention education on these topics as well. So I bring that to my work at RAINN. We have a multidisciplinary team. So we have folks on the team that have clinical social work backgrounds, public health backgrounds. We have a couple other attorneys, educators. And so we all sort of combine forces to bring different things to our work with organizations. And so that's what I get to do every day. And it's wonderful. I've been spending most of my time with maritime and military organizations. And that has been a really interesting process for me to learn about all the vulnerabilities and challenges there that I think we'll get into a bit today and, hopefully start to make a difference to that culture.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so exciting to talk with you today about this because like you said, the maritime sector has a lot of, challenges, or how did you say it?
A lot of vulnerabilities, I think I said.
Vulnerabilities, yeah. And it's such a special, environment to work. So maybe we can start with the first question, because I think a lot of our listeners are not really aware or may not be aware about the situation in the USA right now related to SASH, so sexual assault and harassment in the maritime sector specifically. So, And then also, it relates to your job and why you are so, into this matter. So can you please tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So I would say over the last several years, there has been a lot of growth when it comes to attention to sexual assault and sexual harassment in the maritime organization. There's been, some certainly historical incidents, the Midshipman X article, and, so many different strides that have led to changes in prevention and policies when it comes to sexual assault and sexual harassment. There's been the Embark standards. Every mariner builds a respectful culture, and that has enacted a lot of regulation and guidance for vessels that have folks on board for their sea year. And so, a lot of changes lately. I think there's still a really long way to go, but I think it's a beautiful thing that folks are talking about this a lot, that policies are starting to pop up that really are supportive of different reporting pathways and, all of those pieces that are so crucial to making change here. I think in the past, those vulnerabilities really just made it almost impossible for folks to get support. And so I do see change happening, but I still see resistance. I still see, especially, maybe some stigmas that are really still present that make it difficult to bring those policy changes to life. So, when we have a lot of policy and regulation, that's really important. But when practices sort of on the ground don't necessarily match with that, the culture still has a long way to go. And so that's really where we're trying to focus our work. So I would say the U.S. maybe is, hopefully leading the charge when it comes to this issue. I think there's a lot of conversation about it. There's a lot of training about it. I think we can do better with all of those pieces, but I see a lot changing over the last few years.
Yeah, me too. And I think also you see a lot of changes in the working environment this way. So to just make people really understand, because I think outside of the US, not a lot of people know what the Midshipman X article or what really happened. So, and maybe you can please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that, there was a big news article in the biggest news, how do you say that? Biggest news channels,
outlet?
right?
Yep.
Yeah, so in newspapers, on the television, everywhere. And people were talking about not only what's happening on ships, but also on maritime schools, and just what, what seemed to be the basic behavioral norms, I think. And then it turned out that these behavioral norms were really hurting people, but deeply, right? And also abusive. It was super abusive. And I think that was certainly very disruptive in the US, as that people didn't know that this was happening and they didn't understand it. And people also took it for normal, right? If you're in this sector, you just assumed that it was normal to be shouted at and bullied and assaulted and harassed, I think, and abused even. And I think, but maybe you can also tell us, but I see you not, so I think I'm on a good page here. So then when this came out, it went to be dealt with legally. And now we had a lot of court cases, I think, in the US, according to this, where people who are responsible needed to explain what happened. And there were a lot of very courageous, especially women, who stood up and shared what happened to them. And I think then, you can really understand what happened and what boundaries you need to have, and also what is not normal. And then you can create the safe working environment from there, right? I think
that's right. I think that's exactly right. And I think the maritime industry as a whole, has a lot of women to thank for having the courage, like you said, to share their experiences, which are, were deeply harmful. And, this is a pervasive issue that was kept very quiet, largely. It still is. And so for somebody to share their experience like that is just so brave, and thankfully has resulted in a lot of change. There's a long way to go. And that is owed to those women and many other mariners of all genders who have experienced this. There's a long way to go, but it was met with, I think, a lot of policy change and opened a lot of eyes to something that had been happening. And I think before, folks come forward and share their experience, and there have been many since who have, it's very easy to say, I don't think that's happening here. That might be happening elsewhere, but not in my company, not on my ship, not on my watch. And we now know that is not true. And you can't keep saying that once you acknowledge, these stories that are, absolutely accurate and credible. And, there's no doubting it. There's no denying it now. And so there's a sort of conversation that we have in our teaching and our training sometimes that a colleague of mine came up with that I love, which is this sort of circular visual with arrows that has unaware as the start, and then an arrow to aware, and then it goes to making change and all of those things. But the arrow only goes one way from aware. Once you leave unaware, you cannot go back. Once you're aware, that's it. You are aware, and now you can do work. And sometimes you have that backslide, and you say, something didn't work out, or we didn't realize there was still this other problem we have to face. But you can never go back to unaware. And I think that's where we are, and we owe that to the courageous survivors who shared their stories and who said, this is happening here. And you can't deny that it is, that work needs to be done because people are truly being harmed. And that is not just something that is part of the maritime experience, that you have to be able to put up with this or that to be strong enough to be here. That is absolutely not the case. And so, we've made some big strides, but there is a long way to go. And I think there are, at every organization, there are people who are really dedicated and engaged, and there are people who still deny that this problem is as large of a problem as it is. We have a quarter we have up to a quarter of seafarers having experienced harassment and bullying. And we're talking about like nearly 2 million seafarers around the world. So when we think about how many people that means experience this, it is a big problem, really big problem. And
definitely.
I always think about how important safety in general is when we're talking about, shipping companies and, all the cruise lines, like all of these things. Safety is something we talk about all the time. This is a big part of safety. It's, and
it's the basics, if you ask me. Without this, you cannot even have a safe working environment, physically, because you are not safe physically if you're bullied, harassed, and abused, right? Makes sense.
Exactly. These are the humans that are getting the job done. We have to care about each other and the ways that we're harming one another. And so, I think it's shed a lot of really important light on the issue and it kickstarted a lot of conversations. And, I still see when we work with organizations, folks that have been there for a long time. There are some that still have a long way to go in understanding the impact of this. But oftentimes there are people that are, emotional about the idea that like, I didn't realize that this was happening here. And I have such pride in this place or what I do or this school that I went to. And hearing that this happens here, it actually it causes like, and we call it a moral injury to the folks that are connected to that community and maybe had some, maybe they saw and heard things along the way that they didn't recognize and they ignored or they didn't report. Someone disclosed something to them and they didn't know they should do something with that information, like give resources to that person, give support to that person. They just sort of took it as like, this is part of the environment. And that causes a lot of pain and guilt. And so we all have growth to do here.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that goes back to what you just explained. Like if you are aware and you have it make a circle, but if you make that like into a 3D model, that's just imagine that. You will go around. I think it's a spiral, right? You will spiral up together because once you are aware, you actually are capable of making a choice. But if you are not aware, you don't know what you don't know. So you're totally unaware. So I can understand that these people might feel guilty or, looking back that they didn't have the same experience. This is in a way good. But once you are aware, you will actually have a choice to make, right? You cannot change what happened in the past, but you can change what's happening right now to make sure that, people in the future will come along spiraling up together with us, right? Yeah,
I love that.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, and also just to give, because when you were talking about, sorry to come back to this again, but I really want the listeners to understand how big the Midshipman X thing is in the US, still is. I think we have a terrible court case in France right now, with Giselle, the very courageous woman, which I like, that's just like changing, shifting, spiraling up everybody in this way. And I think especially in the maritime sector, the Midshipman X articles and everything that was talked about really did the same. Is that right? Is that a little bit the same?
I think so. I would say in my conversations with organizations, it often comes up as sort of the start of a movement. And so, the courageous woman that we're referring to was starting out her career at that time. It was on her sea year, as it's called. And it's, I think that really deserves a lot of thought to think about somebody starting out their career. And this is the experience that is pervasive, on vessels, and at different companies because of all the vulnerabilities that we, mentioned before, those challenges in this environment. It created a really unsafe, you mentioned abusive, absolutely unsafe, harmful environment that, we can't ignore that when somebody comes forward. This is somebody that is starting out in the maritime world and, I'm sure came in with such excitement and energy and positivity, to start out in this world and have worked so hard to get where she was. And then to be met with experiences like that. And she's not alone. And, many other courageous women and men have come forward since. This is an issue that affects all genders. And while it affects women, most statistically, it's certainly something that affects all genders. And even that, I think, is sort of a hurdle to get over for this industry. There are a lot of people that don't even acknowledge that or cannot acknowledge that and are shocked by the statistics. But, I think it really did kickstart a movement. And for that, we all should be grateful, because there are so many people still to this day suffering in silence. And so not only does that hopefully make them feel less alone, but hopefully encourage them to get support in whatever way is comfortable for them, whether that's telling a peer or calling a confidential hotline or accessing, a resource just on their own, whatever it is that's comfortable. It's not always coming forward and making a formal report. That is not always the answer that feels most comfortable. And I think that's something that leads to what you were just mentioning, that unawareness. We often will talk to organizations and they will say things like, actually, we're doing really well here. We haven't received reports in years, or we have one report for a minor bullying incident and that's all. And, part of my job, I feel, is to bring them along to understand what we call the reporting paradox, that when we don't see reports, it's often a sign that the problem is actually much bigger than an organization believes in many ways. When reports are coming in, it means that people feel comfortable making those reports, that people know how to make those reports. The reporting process is accessible to them. They know who to go to and what they will need to share and what happens next. All of those things are really important for a survivor to make an informed decision about how they want to handle their experience. And when those pieces are not there, or a culture is so harmful that somebody does not feel safe coming forward, they keep this to themselves, or maybe they just tell a peer and they don't tell somebody who, triggers a formal report. And that's typically a sign that there's a lot going on that needs to be worked on. And rather, organizations think it's a sign of these incidents not happening at all. They're in that unaware place.
Yeah.
And so there's sometimes resistance to dedicate resources and effort to this issue because they think there's no need, because there's no one making reports. So there is no sexual assault happening. There's no harassment. There's no bullying. Nobody's telling me. Or, we had one report, but it was something minor. But let's think about how difficult it is to make a report about something like sexual assault and to have to go through all of the things that a survivor goes through, the self-blame, the fear of retaliation. We could go on and on about all of the concerns a survivor has to face. Whereas if there's something minor that happens, perhaps that person is less concerned about retaliation. They're less worried about, the shame that they might feel for themselves, which, although the rest of us know that they shouldn't feel ashamed, that's a natural feeling a survivor might go through. And so when somebody goes through something that, is on that other end of that continuum of harm, as we call it, all the different harmful behaviors that we might see, something like sexual harassment or sexual assault, it's very possible they won't make a report. And so the lack of reports certainly does not indicate a lack of incidents or a lack of need for support. And that's a difficult thing, I think, for a lot of leaders to process, to say, I don't know of anything, but I still need to act.
Yeah, definitely. And so before we hop into this, maybe dive a little bit into what you can actually do with your policy and maybe procedures, or what you can really do as an organization, because I would love to dive into this. I think, oh, now I forgot it.
Oh. I have too much going on upstairs that we lose.
I have. I know it again. So before we dive into what we can really do about policy, I think it would be good to talk about that. I think in general, we see a little shift right now in the maritime sector, but maybe also outside of the maritime sector. Because what I'm noticing is that a lot of organizations outside of the organization who actually employ people ask and demand sometimes policies for social and psychological safety. So, for example, the other day I came across, so I work in a ship management company, and we needed to prove to a shipper, so the company that has cargo and want it transported, that we really took care of the people we employ and that we kept everybody on board safe and also in a psychological and social way. And I think this is so encouraging to have, because then you don't need, it's good if people can speak up and report, of course, but you don't have to wait for that. You don't have to wait for people to be hurt and be destroyed. You just can create a safe working environment right now for everybody. So that was the thing that I wanted to touch on a little bit. So could you please tell us a little bit more about what good policy in this respect has?
Yeah, that sounds great. So our work at RAINN Consulting Group sometimes starts with an assessment. We'll look at the policies and the practices, the procedures that are already in place, and see where there are opportunities to strengthen them, to make them more trauma-informed, which is so important. Let's think about for a second how it might feel for a survivor to read a company policy that leads with something like, what happens when someone makes a false report? I see so many organizations that have a big, strong, robust policy about false reports. Now, what we actually know is that false reports are extremely uncommon. There's under 8%, sometimes as low as 1 or 2%. And so leading with that, when we know that is absolutely the exception and not the norm, tells a survivor that there's a very good chance that we're going to assume that you might be making a false report, that something happened to you. And so when you're already facing all of those barriers we talked about, fear of retaliation, self-blame, embarrassment, questioning like if they're going to be perceived as the cause of the harm that they suffered, all of those things that somebody might be going through. And then they go to the report and they say, the policy, and they say, well, let me see what would happen if I made a report. And the first thing they read is about false reports. Do we think that there's any chance that this person's going to feel comfortable coming? We're putting people in an impossible position to talk about something that is extremely difficult and traumatic and face this steep uphill battle about the response they're going to get. So, so many times we see policies leading with things like that instead of that, like that's not what we would call trauma informed. That doesn't take into consideration, first of all, the what we realistically know, what statistics and research tells us about these incidents, how often they happen, how infrequently somebody would make a false report. They're also not cognizant of what trauma does to somebody. And so we really want to keep that framework in mind when we're looking at a policy. Is it trauma informed? And is it fair? Is it accessible? Is it equitable? All of those things. So, that's one example of something that we see often. What we don't always see, but we think is really important, are things like safe to report policies, or what, colleges, for example, might call an amnesty policy. Let's say somebody is engaged in some behavior that is against policy. Let's say they are consuming alcohol or, whatever policy it might be. There's a curfew policy and they're breaking that, something like that. And a sexual assault happens, let's say. Of course, there's a fear that if they make a report that they might be punished for having broken a rule. But we know that we want that person to receive care. We want to know that perpetrator who committed that sexual assault is not going to be kept on the ship, let's say, to continue that behavior and harm others. But if that person is too afraid to make a report because they feel like they might get in trouble for the policy that they were in violation of, they have just another reason not to make a report. So we like to see something like a safe to report policy or an amnesty policy as an example. There's lots of different things that we would recommend, anti-retaliation policies, so that it's very clear that retaliation is not going to be tolerated. It's against the law. It's against policy. All of those things are so important because a survivor might go to the policy to determine what their next steps are. And when those policies are either really bare bones, there's not much to them, they don't give examples. Sometimes we don't even know if certain behavior is in violation of policy or not. Like something might happen that makes you feel unsafe, uncomfortable, scared, all of those things. And then you go to the policy and it's not even clear whether it's a violation of policy or not. So of course you're not going to report it because you don't even know what would happen if you did.
So let me just ask, because then I can really understand, what is exactly a safety report policy saying that? Because I think it's very important, especially to talk about the gray areas right here, because that's super, super good. That's like also prevention. If it's gray area, or if it was allowed or if it was not allowed, or, if it is good behavior or if you're just wrong about it, that's also taking away the gaslighting and making connection between people even better, right? So what does a safety report policy then exactly say?
Yeah. So if someone is in violation of, let's say, an alcohol policy, but there's a sexual assault, we want to encourage that person to be able to make a report without fear that they are going to be held responsible for that more minor policy that they were in violation of. It would encourage their reporting and sort of give them some, immunity, for lack of a better word, about that other policy, because we want to approach it that, like, what's more important here is that we know that this perpetrator is going to be held accountable, that we know that this thing happened so that we can do that, and that you can get the care and the safety that you deserve. And so if you can't make a report because you're afraid of what might happen to you if you do, we're never going to get that information. We're not going to know that it happened as a company. We're not going to know to handle this perpetrator, and they're going to continue, most likely, to commit harm to others. And so it's, there's lots of things that we can suggest when we can actually dig into a policy. And so, not to make it a commercial, but it's certainly hopefully would want to encourage organizations to seek support from an organization like ours to look at their policy with a trauma-informed lens. It's something that we have expertise in, but a lot of organizations, they might have somebody who's adept at writing policy, but if they're not looking at it from that lens, it might not be supportive and encouraging of reports. And that's really important.
Definitely. Trauma-informed policy you need to have. Yeah, that's such a good advice. And if you don't know what trauma-informed is, you can read the book from Gabor Mate about this. Do you know this book? The Myth of Normal?
Oh. No, I haven't heard this.
Well, if you're listening right now and want to know more about what a trauma-informed society could look like, then you need to I will make sure there's a link to this book. It's called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. I can recommend very much reading that.
That sounds great. That's awesome. Yeah. The more we learn about these things and talk about them, the more we normalize this conversation, and attention to these issues. And it's just so important. I think it's not how many mariners came up through the ranks, right? Talking about these things, even just in general, like when we were young, we didn't have education about these things in school, about healthy boundaries and consent. All of those
consent,
things.
Yeah. If you're talking about alcohol, that's a good point of discussion about what consent means, because I think, I'm not, you can say if I'm not right, but if you're drunk, you cannot even have consent. Right. Yeah, you cannot even have a consensuous situation with somebody. So you're not able to. Yeah. So then, going back to the reporting things, then it's really important that you're not getting any negative consequences for speaking up because you drank alcohol. Yeah. It's important to say that you just did, because, we're all human. Mm-hmm. Also. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And there's children in school are learning about those things now, but we didn't have that education when we were young. So I do feel optimistic, as much as, we spend all day dealing with these issues, and it's very easy to get negative and say, geez, this is happening everywhere. This is such a huge problem. And that is all true. But I do feel optimistic because people are having these conversations from the time that they're in elementary school now. And so it's going to be much more normal to talk about these issues and to have structures in place that support healthy environments and psychologically safe environments, physically safe. We're talking about even physical safety here.
Yeah.
And it's part of the conversation now for younger folks that are coming up. But, us folks who've been here for a while have learning to do. And so I think, when it's often a barrier that we see with leadership, for example, who have typically been around for a while, and that's why they're in those leadership roles. This might be, the last 5 or 10 years might be the first time they've even heard some of these terms in the first place, to have to think about something like psychological safety or, boundaries or consent. In this context, it might be new to a lot of people, and certainly new to think about the prevalence of these issues and how things like the chain of command structure, the male-dominated environment, the isolation that folks feel at sea, all of those things play into an environment that we need to devote a lot of attention to safety, because it's not naturally there. We've got a lot of uphill battles to go.
Well, definitely. So before we close out, I want to emphasize, because I really liked what we talked about, and you gave so much tools, what we can do and what people can think about. Also, I really want to say, if you have any questions about what we talked about, please leave a comment. So, we can come back to that and answer. So I really want to talk about vulnerability and weakness, because I think especially in the maritime sector, there's such a big misunderstanding between vulnerability and weakness, right? To be vulnerable and to be sharing what you are feeling is not a sign of weakness. It's the other way around. It's really the other way around. You can be so much more stronger and trusted if you are able to share what you're feeling, right? And if you're able to make connection to your team, even especially as a leader, I would say. So is that also your understanding of the sector this way?
Absolutely. I think in working with different organizations and military organizations, I hear from a lot of people that they are afraid to speak about their experiences or to ask for help because they are afraid that they're going to be seen as unfit for duty or unsafe to operate a vessel or a danger to be around because they have experienced trauma. And none of those things are true. And so but the stigma is absolutely there. There is a real fear to ask for help. And I say that because it goes beyond just making reports of sexual misconduct, but rather to ask for help at all. I mean, if somebody is struggling with mental health, with bullying, any of those things, to say, hey, I need some support, or I'd like to speak to somebody for some support. Like, let's take a cadet, for example. There are programs at the academies and at colleges for support, but people are afraid to access them. And so if we actually could have, special vision to see how many people need help versus how many people are accessing help, there's a huge disparity. And it's because it's fear-based in many cases, because they're afraid that they're going to be seen as weak and not strong enough. And these, many times this is certainly across the board, all age groups, all roles.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
In speaking about, people who are starting out their career, they're afraid that's going to follow them, that they're going to be seen as weak or, and that's something that is so strength is so celebrated when it comes to maritime, law enforcement, military, all of these different categories. Strength is celebrated. And what should be celebrated, like you mentioned, is their strength in coming forward. When we think about the Midshipman X article, that is strength. That's courage.
Definitely.
Wow. But I am sure that that many others in that person's position, and I don't want to speak for her, but, perhaps her as well, if not many others in her position, probably struggled for a while with fear of coming forward because of that. And rather, many of us see that as strength, but on the whole, there's a fear, and there are many people that will treat it as weakness. We have a long way to go there. That is a real big problem, that people are seen as weak if they come forward and ask for help. And it's just the opposite, like you said.
Yeah, and let me because I just thought about something. So we will make this episode a little bit longer. Sorry for you listeners, but this is important. Because I think I'm going to tell about my own experience. So I had traumatic experience on board of a vessel myself, and it was not relating to SASH or assault and harassment. So that's easy to understand. It was a natural disaster that happened, and it really had big consequences. I also wrote an article on LinkedIn about it. I will share it if you want to read it. I'm very open about this, so it's okay. But while you were talking about the fear of speaking up, I can remember that when this happened to me, I didn't even want to think about that it ever happened to me because I didn't want it. My mind just said, it never happened. You will never, ever talk about this. This just didn't happen. We will just make a big concrete plate. We will put it on top of everything you saw and everything you felt, and it will just not be there. So when somebody asked me, also from the company, a lot of people ask me, do you want to talk about it? Do you want to have counseling or, therapy, or do you need anything? I just said, no, I'm good. I'm sleeping well. Nothing is wrong. And it took quite a few years. It took me like 15 years before it rose again, because what I discovered is that, it was not gone. It was just had these tentacles, and it came through in all different ways. And you cannot ignore certain things. If you really want to, you can try, but, your body is smarter than your mind is. So, yeah. So I think the internal fear is also a big one. So it's not even the fear of what other people tell you, that you're weak or that you're not strong enough. It's also the voice inside your own head that says, you are not strong enough. You should be able to handle this. You don't need help. You can do this alone. Like, this is a very terrible voice you could have in your mind. So if you're listening to this, I really want to say that this voice is there not for nothing. It has a big value, but you can always have somebody aside of that voice. That's a good start. Also asking for help is not asking somebody for you to take over things. You're always there. You're always in charge. So, yeah, I hope this is valuable for any listeners.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Eva. I think in working with survivors in my last role, I often heard people say things like, I promised myself I would never tell anyone. And it's hard for other people to understand that, because maybe people who haven't experienced that would say, well, why didn't you ask for help? But it is such a natural response. And you bring up some really important points about, those conversations we have with ourselves about, what we think we should handle. Sometimes there might be confusion about why our bodies responded the way that they did in the face of trauma, especially when we're talking about people that, are high functioning and strong in so many areas of their life. They may say something like, I don't know why I let this happen, or I don't know why I didn't do X, Y, or Z when this happened. And, so much of that goes to what our brains do during trauma that is, instinctual and we cannot, act against. But it's, I really hope that this will help reframe for folks that it really is strength to go through these things and come out the other end, and especially, to move forward in whatever way is comfortable, whether that's talking to a friend or, accessing a resource, making a formal report. Like, there's a number of different ways. It doesn't have to look the same for everybody. There's no wrong way to handle it, because everybody has to do things in their own time and in their own way and have that agency. Like you said, nobody else gets to take over control and say, this is how we're going to help you. It's like, rather, you have to be in that driver's seat. And that's when you're getting good care, when somebody can support you and say, I'm here, but you're in charge. What can I do for you? Like, you're still in charge of what that healing looks like. And so I thank you for sharing your experience. I think that hearing that can be really helpful for others to not feel alone in it.
Yeah, I hope so. So thank you very much for saying that. So I think we came to the end a little bit. So before we end, I want to ask you this question, and I'm asking it to all the people on my podcast here in Yachting International Radio, because my biggest wish is for us all to see and recognize the human kindness within ourselves and in the other. So my question is, what makes you feel human and in connection with humankind?
I love that question, Eva. I would say two answers come to mind. One has to do with my work and one doesn't. I feel so lucky and grateful in this life that I have gotten to be in roles where I feel like I can help, like a helping role. And I feel very privileged to be able to do that, whether it be directly to people who have struggled and experienced these sorts of things, or to work on preventing it from happening at all. I feel really grateful, and that makes me feel a lot of connection with the humans around me, that I feel like I'm doing something, some small step to try to help with these issues. And the other thing is just being with my family. I have 2 children and a husband, and it makes me feel so fulfilled to be able to spend time with them. And so I am, always recharged by that sort of time. So thank you so much. Appreciate that.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And also, I think a lot of people recognize, right, that you can just fill your energy cup by being around your favorite people, and then, ooh.
Yes.
So much love. Yeah, that's nice. Thank you for that. So, and also, thank you very much for this interview today. It was so valuable to listen. So thank you for
having me. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you also for the listeners today. I hope you learned a little bit more about inclusion and safety, and also policy. And feel free to share if you did. And before we say goodbye, please remember to be grateful to the earth and open to the universe. And I see you in the next episode. Tot ziens.